Hi everyone, my name is Nicola Komninos and I'm the Group Chief Risk Officer of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And in my capacity as a member of the IRMSA Risk Intelligence Committee, it's my great privilege to be talking with you today in collaboration with Basani Maluleke, who is the CEO of African Bank.
Thank you.
Welcome and thank you for joining me. Okay, so before we go into the conversation, I wanted to give you a bit of context. We are specifically talking about the IRMSA 2021 risk report. And we wanted to get some input, thoughts, perspectives in terms of risks as well as opportunities that are facing us in the South African environment looking ahead into 2021. And so we wanted to talk to Basani specifically about that. But before we jump into that, I wanted to give you a bit of background on her. She's got a very impressive career and background as an admitted attorney from the High Court and currently, as I've mentioned, in retail banking in the CEO capacity, and previously also worked in corporate finance. So over 12 years experience in financial services, and prior to that coming with a legal background. So a great privilege to be talking to you. And I think just mentioning in her personal capacity, also doing some great work to further the education in our country as she sits as a member of the Wits Council, as well as a trustee of the Clicks Foundation. And there, I understand you guys are doing some great work for primary school students to specifically further work in terms of maths as well as English. So very impressive and looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Thank you, Nicola. That's a wonderful introduction.
So as I've mentioned, a great privilege and honor for us to be talking to the CEO of African Bank, Basani. And we're going to jump right into it with the first question of asking you, Basani, how you would describe the current local and global risk landscape as well as the outlook looking out into 2021?
So in a word, grim. I think it's popular knowledge that the quality of leadership is the primary determinant of whether an organization or even a country succeeds or fails. And when you look out at the global leadership at the moment, it's not particularly encouraging. You've got President Trump in the United States, who seems to have embraced all sorts of undesirable ideologies. You've got President Xi, who seems to have embraced authoritarianism. And in Europe, you've got Prime Minister Johnson, who seems to have handled Brexit in a very chaotic fashion. We don't have that strong global leadership that I think we used to have. And what makes me particularly sad about that is we need this kind of global coordination, particularly now around resolving COVID. So we need a coordinated response around how do we get the vaccine out, if we do get a vaccine, and how do different countries actually respond to that. And secondly, when you think about technological disruption, it has got the possibility of increasing inequality both within countries and between countries. So it would be awesome to actually have some global coordination around how we deal with that to ensure that we continue to have global trade that works optimally. So I definitely worry about that leadership. And then when I think about South Africa, I think we have a similar issue around leadership. So while I think President Ramaphosa enjoys credibility in certain sectors of our society, I think the conflict that he seems to have around prioritizing the country's interests versus the ANC's interests creates a lot of friction in that, there's this gridlock around, how do we hold people accountable, for example? How do we make sure that service delivery actually happens and we improve people's lives? So I think there is a huge issue for us as well around leadership. And, while there are some green shoots that we're seeing at the moment around people being held accountable, it definitely has not been the case. And we have a long way to go, I think, before we can say that we're on the right path. But on the bright side, I do think this kind of dearth of leadership at a political level does create space for more civil society interaction or leadership, as well as leadership from corporates. Not that there aren't issues there as well, but certainly it creates the space for us to get more involved and to move the country forward.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely we've got visionary leadership in terms of our president. It's just those really unpopular decisions that might have to be made at some point in time.
I totally agree.
So that's some great insights. And the lack of leadership in the global arena, there's a vacuum and certainly opportunity, I think, for others to step in and like you've said. So how would you then, let's go into the second question. What would you see as the top risk that you're currently dealing with in your role as the CEO of African Bank? And how this is impacting specifically on how you're achieving your strategy as well as the performance in your current environment in the retail banking sector?
So for us, it's definitely a prolonged and deep recession. So when I look at our business, we've had some really great successes. We launched our transactional banking product. Last year, we won the best bank for customer service. Recently, in the Brand Eye report, we won the best bank for customer sentiment. So customers are feeling that we're doing the right things, particularly around responding to customer queries and on our digital platforms. So the leading indicators of success are there, but we just don't have the tailwind of an economy that's working. So the longer that this recession lasts and the deeper that it is, the more difficult it will be for us to achieve our strategy. So you might have seen that in our interim reports, in our interim results, released in June of this year, we reported a loss of 111 million rand. And the biggest reason for that loss was because we had to provide an additional almost 1 billion rand of impairments. Now, this is the case for all banks. And as you can imagine, the larger your impairments, the lower your profitability. And as a result, the bigger the focus on reducing costs, which leads to retrenchments typically. And with more retrenchments means more defaults means more impairments, less profitability. So we seem to be in this really vicious cycle, which worries me. And which is why for me, the biggest risk is this recession that we seem to be going into. However, I also recognize that necessity is the mother of invention. And as a result, I do think that we are going to see a lot more innovation, and we're already seeing it, right? We've seen this launch of the new aircraft, of the new flight rather, called Lift. And we're seeing a lot more happening as well in the fintech space. So there's a lot of gloom, but I do think that with gloom often comes opportunity.
Sure, I have to concur. I mean, I think one of the biggest risks we're currently facing is just default. What would happen? When will it happen? It's so unpredictable.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the sort of long-term economic impact. And the digital divide is just so real and practical. So then maybe just making a little bit more personal, specifically, which are the current risks that are highlighted in the risk report. So we had about 12 risks that we highlighted in the IRMSA 2021 risk report. And we wanted to ask you which one specifically resonates with you, and that you'd like to share some personal insights and how you've potentially had to adapt your strategies, specifically looking at those risks.
So for me, it's definitely deepening
structural inequality. So it's such a challenge in our country.
Precisely. I mean, as it is, we have such deep inequality. And as I was saying earlier, I do think that this digital divide we're talking about, has the potential to worsen that inequality. So which is a terrible thing to imagine. So, it's often written that Black women in particular suffer the most from inequality because they live on the margins of society, and typically they're the worst paid or the lowest paid people in society. And we also saw that with COVID, when people started to report on unemployment, the people who were most affected were Black women. And this is obviously quite a personal thing for me, this issue around the difficulty that Black women typically have in society. And I think why we should all be concerned is that typically Black women raise children, and they also look after elderly parents. So the poorer that they become, the less able they are to feed those children. And with those kids suffering from malnutrition, I think educational outcomes then get worse. And it means that the talent pool that we're going to have as business to pull from in the future is going to be very diminished. So from an African bank perspective, in terms of inequality, we are very clear about making sure that we're giving people loans and products at a price point that makes sense, right? So we were particularly proud of the fact that our transactional account is the lowest fee account in the market. And it is because we know that people have been complaining about bank fees for as long as I can remember. And similarly, we offer the best rates in terms of investments and so on. And again, that is geared towards the lower end of the market and making sure that they're able to benefit from the same interest rates that people who have a lot more money would typically be able to benefit. Typically, people with more money get the best interest rates, and people with less money don't.
Counterintuitive.
It is,
but
exactly.
Yeah, I understand.
So we're trying very hard to find ways to bridge that. And then I think in your introduction, you spoke about the fact that I'm involved with the Click Foundation. I'm very proud of the work that the foundation has done in terms of introducing greater levels of education and knowledge into under-resourced schools. I think that they've done amazing work. And I'm also a member of the Wits University Council. And as a member of that council, I play a very small role in contributing to how we shape tertiary education and access to tertiary education for our youth.
But I mean, it's so structural and like you said, societal, because really the mothers of society are struggling, and how do they make sure that they bring up and they educate and they just take care of the basics of feeding the next generation. So that's so important. So just a curiosity, do you, in terms of the percentage of loans you issue, do you track the amount of black females you issue loans to? Is that a specific target or strategic priority?
We actually don't, but what we have been tracking is on our transactional account.
Okay.
And interestingly, we are seeing that there's a bias towards women and a bias towards youth.
Okay.
Which is great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's good. I think those are the numbers that we want to be tracking, because if we're talking about the systemic risk and structurally what's happening in the country. And then I just wanted to ask you our fourth and second to last question. What valuable insights have you specifically gleaned from the global pandemic? So we've all said COVID-19 came left field. Some people are saying it was a black swan. Not quite sure, because we did have some infectious disease on our risk registers. We just didn't know when it will happen or how it will happen. So I suppose the timing was just not necessarily known to us. But specifically what you've gleaned from that, and also how that has potentially impacted your strategies.
So I think one of the biggest lessons for me personally is realizing how important it is to have autonomy. I think we've had to trust people to work from home, and they have exceeded all expectation. They've used the autonomy to structure their days in ways that make sense, and as a result, I think the business has been better off for it. So I think that for me was one of the biggest lessons. The other one is just around the beauty of technology, right? So if you force people to do something, they will adapt. So the adaptability of humans is truly extraordinary. And I think I see that in two ways. So the first is that obviously many of us working from home have had to adapt to working with Teams or on Zoom or whichever technology that we've chosen to use to connect with our colleagues. But the other one has just been around seeing how customers have evolved.
Oh, yeah.
So we saw, I think, a 300% increase in traffic to our digital channels during lockdown,
wow.
which is extraordinary. We also saw a significant increase in the download of our apps, people using our chatbot to service themselves instead of going into a branch. So look, so that for me has been a fabulous learning. But also, having said that, once lockdown started to ease up, people returned to our branches in ways that they in kind of the same numbers that were there previously. Okay. So I guess, look, people, our customer base maybe in particular, doesn't seem to love digital, but the moment that they're forced to use it, they will use it. So I think that was also a big learning.
Sure, that's very interesting. Yeah, so I think we human are creatures of habit. So I suppose it'll be interesting to see how we all also maybe potentially move back into the office space. Have you thought of reducing your office space? I suppose you have to have people at the branches, but maybe you've got a hybrid setup now where you maybe have some working remotely and others at the office.
We definitely have a hybrid, and I think there's a big preference issue. So I prefer to be in the office. As a result, I go into the office, as do some of my colleagues. But then there are also people who just don't want to come back. Yeah. So fortunately, we own our campus in Midrand, so I suppose we don't have to reduce our footprint because of that. Okay. But also, you know, Nicola, I'm not sure that we've reached maturity yet in terms of understanding how people will want to work. So I'm kind of reluctant to have to make any big calls yet around office space until we've seen how this thing plays out.
Yeah, but you're right. And I think that's exactly the approach I've seen quite a number of businesses, specifically in financial services, are open. And it's been amazing how the CEOs and the older generations have really been open to this remote working and trusting your workforce and giving them options and different opportunities, which has been amazing. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out in 2021. So let's end off with the last question. How would you characterize the South African geopolitical landscape? So a really tough question. We leave them for the last ones. And what are the global themes that are impacting on South Africa? I think you spoke a bit maybe about the leadership internationally, but maybe those other elements that you think will impact us.
Yeah, this is a tough one. It's like really nailing my colors to the mast. So mine still goes back to inequality, to deepening inequality. So as we spoke earlier about the fact that we've got the biggest Gini coefficient in the world, or thereabouts. So what I worry about is that deepening inequality has an impact on political outcomes. So what typically happens is that the wealthier people are, the more they are able to influence political outcomes. And when people on the margins of society, so those who are getting poorer, as others get wealthier, start to feel like they're losing political power. They start to feel more and more marginalized. And as a result, they become more susceptible to leaders with populist ideas. And in South Africa, I think that's a real issue. And given where we are with leadership, political leadership already so weakened in South Africa, I think the risk of this for us is a real risk. I think you've seen that play out in both Europe and in the US, with people feeling marginalized. I think the question then becomes, how do we start to create spaces or initiatives that reduce inequality, that make people feel less like they're on the margins? How do we create social safety nets so people feel taken care of and not like they are being ignored? I'm encouraged by the fact that over the last few months, I've seen and heard more and more people talk about it. I've heard business people talk about it. I'm hearing more and more politicians talk about the need to fix this issue of inequality. And that gives me hope that, in the kind of months ahead, these issues will remain center stage and will start to be addressed.
No, definitely. And I mean, just looking at the unemployment rate currently being quoted at 30.8%, there just really is such a big structural challenge. And if we don't bring in more of a socialist democracy,
I think that's right.
The reality is we are not going to be taking care of the country in the medium and long term. So
agreed.
Have to agree with
and you may have seen that, I think it was Intellidex that published a report saying that the expanded definition of unemployment is sitting at about 44%. That number is 44%. I mean, if you have close to half of your working age population staying at home, I mean, that does not bode well for the future.
So that was such a wonderful conversation we've just had with Basani. I think talking about some really heavy issues, the deepening structural inequality that we're observing, some of the big risks we're facing, the scarcity of unified, ethical and visionary leadership. But then we reflected on the fact that we do have a very visionary leader in South Africa, and there's some great opportunities for him to step in and potentially make some unpopular decisions, but he can certainly change the narrative, and there's some great opportunities in our space. Like in the digital space, we've seen some technology innovation, and the way we're engaging with you now in this report is just one of those examples. We've seen the uptake Basani spoke about in terms of the use of digital platforms of her clientele, and certainly there's other opportunities, and we don't want to waste a great crisis. I think COVID-19 has just shown how we as South Africans are so resilient, and I am very excited to see how we will take opportunity in this really tough economic climate. And so maybe one last word from Basani, just in terms of how African Bank are positioning themselves in the year of 2021.
So 2020, and I'm sure 2021 will also be remembered mostly for COVID. And as a result, we have diverted a lot of our CSI funds towards alleviating hunger, towards assisting students to acquire devices so they can learn from home and study from home and work virtually. And we will continue to do that because ultimately, African Bank, we are all about serving our people. Our purpose is to advance lives, and we will continue to focus on doing that during COVID to ensure that when our customers look back, they can be confident that we were there for them during this very difficult time. But over and above our CSI, our products continue to be shaped around ensuring that they advance our customers' lives. And maybe the best way that we do that is by the fact that we do offer the cheapest transactional account in the market, and we offer the best savings rates of all the institutions in the country, and we have seen the benefits of that, particularly in the mass market. So thank you very much, Nicola, for having had me on the show. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope I've added value to all your listeners.
Sure. Thank you, Basani. It was a great privilege and honor to have this conversation with you.